I'll get back to your calls in a few moments, but continuing with our reflections, really, a year on from the Grenfell fire, I'm joined in the studio by Simon Elmer, co-founder and director of Architects for Social Housing. Now, this is a group of architects and social campaigners who've tried not just with Grenfell, but to stop the demolition of council houses, of social housing, and to find alternative ways to increase capacities, if that's what the answer is, or to increase space in or around those places, and of course make them safer. Simon and his group worked with the Grenfell Action Group long before the fire ever happened, and is here to talk about it. I know, Simon, that you're keen for, in the conversation about Grenfell, you're keen to stress that the national conversation really cannot just be about Grenfell. It has to be broader than that, about social housing and the safety of social housing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's not more generally known about Grenfell is that in 2009, the estate it was on, Lancaster West, that and the neighbouring Silchester estate were part of a estate regeneration programme. Initially in 2009, it was for the demolition and redevelopment of that estate. And Grenfell Tower was particularly cited in the plans as being a blight on the area. Now, after that...
This is 2008?
This is 2009. Because of the financial crash then, the value of London housing kind of plateaued off for a while. So the council went for a partial demolition programme and a refurbishment one. And in the planning application for that, the reasons given for the cladding put on Grenfell Tower were about its external appearance. Now, the reason for this is having a concrete post-war tower block in an area like that, it deflates the value of the land. And the purpose of refurbishment of the estate regeneration programme is to realise what they call the latent potential value uplift in the land, which comes from building high-value property on it. This shows
even if Grenfell were to stay there, it looking nicer makes whatever else is there more valuable.
I'm talking about how it was perceived from the surrounding area. Now, the kind of managerial, if you like, structures which are in place, which put the technical reasons for the fire, the cladding and so on and so forth, that's being replicated in estate regeneration programme schemes, individual schemes, all over London. Last year we did a kind of a mapping project, and we identified about 237 council estates which have recently undergone or are undergoing or are threatened with being regenerated in this way.
And that regeneration sounds like such a positive word, but would it mean in every case people moving out and sometimes never moving back in? Yeah,
regeneration can mean privatisation. So a lot of the times council stock is transferred into a housing association, for instance. Sometimes it can mean simply a kind of gutting the building, taking the residents out, and then the cost of actually refurbishing it to very high standards means a lot of them can't come back in. Mostly, though, overwhelmingly, it means the demolition of the estate and its redevelopment. And in almost every case, the ones that we identified, that leads to a quite substantial loss of social housing. That is homes for social rent.
And the work that you did with the Grenfell Action Group and others, I know, but let's focus on the Grenfell Action Group and the work you did with them long before the fire. That was to do what? Was it to go to listen to them, obviously, to meet those people who live there, and then take your ideas, your organisation's ideas to the council about how differently you could do this without disrupting and perhaps most of all removing the residents?
Yeah, what we do is we've done this on about 6 estates across London, and we were brought in to talk to the Silchester estate, which is right neighbouring it. Instead of demolishing estates, which, as I said, leads to the loss of social housing, we found out that we can increase housing capacity on these estates by up to about 50%. In doing so, we can sell about half of those to generate the funds to refurbish these other estates, the existing council housing, which has often been neglected for many decades in some cases. And we can also produce, out of the other 50%, more council housing, that is homes for social rent. Importantly, though...
And this wasn't all high-rise?
No. We can do it. A lot of these estates, the post-war estates, were built at a time when London actually there was a kind of a population flight out of London. There's quite a lot of room in them. You can build infill, that is between the existing buildings, but they're also very well made. They're made of reinforced concrete.
So you can build on them?
You can build on top of them. We can build 1 or 2 stories on top of them with lightweight kind of... and we've got this kind of quantity surveyors to cost it. And the important thing is refurbishing an estate and increasing its capacity by 50% costs around about half as much as merely demolishing and replacing just the existing homes.
And this was greeted how, these suggestions?
By the residents very, very, very positively. Yes, We've got quite a lot of work in that way. By the council, though, as I said, the purpose of estate regeneration is to realise the latent
what's
value
underneath
in
the
the
property.
land. And we don't do that. What we do is provide more council housing.
So we'll come to your thoughts on the night when when the story emerged, but just before it and since the fire, what's been your impression? I mean, we'll be careful, and we'll give the inquiry. We'll honour the fact that the inquiry is trying to establish precisely what happened and how and what needs to change. But is it your understanding that actually there was never any real consideration of the futures and the safety of the people living in Grenfell?
Just recently, I've been reading the Dr. Lane, a fire expert, who's produced an exhaustive, well, not exhaustive, but a considerable report on what actually happened in the building at the night of the fire. And reading through it is it's quite horrible seeing it. But one of the things she's identified is that a lot of the fire safety measures which were built into the building, things like fire doors, like lifts, like smoke detectors, like smoke extractors and so on and so forth, these had all been refurbished as part of the general refurbishment of the building. And almost all of them had either failed or were not compliant with fire regulations. That's one of the things she says. The other thing, though, and this is something that the residents complained about, but
that's already been heard in the inquiry, hasn't it, that section? Yeah.
But what she comes to the same conclusion that we did when we wrote a large report about a month after the fire about what we knew about it, and that is that even if all those measures had been working, the cladding, the nature of the cladding system, effectively circumvented them and made all the rest of the stuff redundant. And she said, even if all those
because
were working,
fire was wrapping
because the
around
fire was
the
wrapping
building.
around the building, and importantly, she comes to the conclusion that the fire brigade, the London Fire Brigade, simply couldn't handle a fire of that virulence that spreads so quickly, and was a multi-storey fire. Really, the fire brigade can do very little in the face of that. And what they did was, I think, probably the best they could have done.
Which a fireman involved on the night said to me just a week or so ago here on LBC. But the morning after the fire, and in the days following it, what were you and your colleagues thinking?
Well, to talk from our position as architects for social housing, we visited the building the day after the fire, and obviously
of your own accord or invited to do so.
We went down to have a look. We know a number of the people. We know Edward Daffan, who was one of the residents who escaped. And we know people who lived around the estate. We went round to talk to them, and one of the things that struck us from an architectural point of view was the building was standing very sternly. There was a lot of talk about it was going to collapse afterwards. It hasn't collapsed, and it didn't. They're very strong buildings. The bit afterwards, there was a lot of talk about that the buildings of this height are dangerous, they're inherently flawed, and they need to be pulled down. And we were very concerned about that, because this, we thought, was feeding into this estate sort of demolition program. What is quite obvious to everyone, I think, is that the building was intact. What lay in burnt shards around the building was the cladding. And we were very intent on trying to distinguish between the safety, the fire safety of these buildings, and the cladding, which of course is extremely unsafe. And so we were very concerned first to combat this narrative that council towers built in the post-war period are unsafe. They're not. And also that the cladding that we began to learn, I think there's nearly 300 buildings in England which have got this type of cladding system, which is not just about the actual materials, but about the system
public
together.
And private
that
housing
needs to be taken down.
Yeah,
public and private housing.
And very little of it has been taken down.
Yeah, I think maybe 10 to 12.
10 examples, yeah.
Which after a year after the fire is really, really disgraceful.
Well, for anybody listening who lives in one of those post-war council or otherwise tower blocks.
I do myself.
You do yourself, okay. And you say they're not unsafe. That'll be a relief for people to hear. If they're wrapped in this cladding, are they unsafe?
Those buildings are built, like all buildings, to be through compartmentation. That means if a fire starts in a flat, it's got about an hour to an hour and a half where the fire will not spread from it if those systems are in place. Oddly enough, last night at 4 and 6 o'clock in the morning, 2 buildings actually had fires, one in Lewisham and one in Glasgow. In both cases, the fire brigade went in and they put the fire out.
And they were contained within
They
one
were
or two
contained in as they were. The unfortunate thing is, and I don't blame people for this, I think I would do the same, when the fire started, everyone in the building ran out.
You would, wouldn't you?
They went against the stay put policy, because this stay put policy is based on the building having compartmentation and the fire brigade getting in it. That wasn't there at Grenfell because the cladding was on it. Once the cladding's in it, you need to get out as quickly as possible. But of course, the cladding shouldn't be on in the first place.
And have you taken your thoughts to the? Are you giving evidence in the inquiry, for example, or are you somehow feeding in your experiences with Grenfell?
We wrote quite a considerable report on the fire, about 28,000 words. We got it out very quickly, about a month after the fire, and we gave it to the Grenfell Action Group, and we submitted it as part of the information in the inquiry, the evidence to the inquiry. That report has been quite well circulated in kind of strange places, actually. So a lot of people have had to come in and talk about it. Nobody's asked us to come to talk at the inquiry, which I think the inquiry has been quite limited in its kind of remit about its frames of reference to the technical causes of the fire, I think, and how it happened and why it happened. We think that's too narrow because it's not just about...
You would support, because again, this was questioned in the first few weeks of the inquiry, you would support, would you, the idea of class attitudes, race attitudes being part of what is looked at least?
I think we need to talk about the privatisation of things like fire safety. The fire safety officer who signed off the cladding wasn't in-house, he wasn't part of the council. He is a private consultant. And if you go to his website, the first thing it says is, I can save you money. If we privatise the safety, if we effectively tender out responsibility for the safety of the people who live in these buildings, which includes me and you, whatever, Grenfell is going to happen again. Not a question about it, I think, even though it's quite a dark thing to say. So we have to think about what the role of the public sphere is in assuring the safety of residents. We also have to think about things like why the recommendations after the Lakanor House fire, which happened in Southwark in 2009, the coroner's report recommended, for instance, retrofitting sprinklers on buildings like those from the 70s, like Grenfell Tower, and a number of other safety measures as well. This was run through Parliament, if you like, over and over again by the All-Parliamentary Fire Safety Group. And a whole series of ministers sat, if you could call it that, on that report for years. And the All Fire Safety Group sort of said, if there is another fire, on your head be it, someone has to be accountable for sitting on those measures. And it's not just individual ministers, it's actually the policy of the government to deregulate. And in the words of Brandon Lewis, who was the fire safety minister at the time, or the minister responsible for that, he said, we think fire safety should be in the realm of the private developers, the people who are responsible for the building. That has been shown to be wrong. People talk a lot about what is justice for Grenfell. Justice is for the survivors, that they must be rehoused. Justice has to be the people who perpetrated this, found tried for it, not under something like corporate manslaughter, which simply has a fine, but for negligence of their duty, perhaps even negligent involuntary manslaughter. But we also need to address, our attitude towards the housing, the residents of where people live in their homes.
And just a final question: the residents, the survivors of Grenfell themselves and their supporters have said that the outcome of the inquiry, that the real justice, it has to include big change for everyone, for the future. What just top two changes, if I can be so trite, just because there's so much to think about it. What big change or changes have to be that justice, would you say?
Certainly there has to be change to the regulations in things like fire safety. But I think the bigger picture is we need to bring control of the housing of our population back into the public sphere, not to see housing simply as a commodity to generate profit for developers and so on, and to start seeing housing as having a use value, as somewhere where people can live in safety and affordability as well. Okay,
thank you. Good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us today. Simon Elmer, co-founder and director of Architects for Social Housing. Your calls in a moment. Feel free to comment on anything you've just heard there as well. It's 2:49.